Hello. It's so great to see you. I know it's been a while, and I apologize for that. But we're here, and we have another lesson. I call this the Rocky lesson. So we're going to start with the paper that I've sent to you. Two papers they are, and they're really about Deuteronomy for the most part. And Deuteronomy looks back at the Exodus years, the years of the children of Israel going through the wilderness. That's the primary thing about Deuteronomy. In fact, let me give you a little idea of what Deuteronomy is about. It's a retelling of the stories that you read through in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, so that they are review, and they are a review for the second generation Israelites in the wilderness. You remember about the first generation. They had to spend 40 years in the wilderness and die in the wilderness because of their lack of faith in God, their rebellion, their hardening of the heart. They are a stiff necked people, as God called them on numerous occasions. And they were stiff necked because they became afraid, so frightened that they didn't want to do what God wanted them to do. So, anyway, we're at Deuteronomy is a retelling of all those stories for this second generation so that they won't repeat what the first generation did. So, Deuteronomy 8 is at the top of the page. We have a synopsis of Exodus to Numbers. He just has it in a couple of verses here, covering the whole wilderness era. So, let me read it to you. Yeah, Deuteronomy 8. Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So we starting with the land of, remember they were in Egypt at the beginning of Exodus, and now God has brought them out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness. Okay, how did he describe that wilderness? Terrifying. Great and terrifying, with its fiery serpents and scorpions. Anyone would be fearful of scorpions and fiery serpents and or snakes. So they got afraid. They got terrified. They let their terror, their fear, their anxieties overwhelm them. And but they forgot that God was leading them. Yahweh was there with them no matter what. And then it says, and thirsty ground where there was no water. Can you imagine? You're in the desert, you're in a wilderness, no water. Of course you'd be frightened. Of course you'd be scared. What are you going to do with that fear? Well, they didn't choose the best way to handle it, did they? In fact, this is why God would keep on calling them a stiff-necked people. All they had to do was turn to him. And they chose fear instead. No water. Who brought you water out of the flinty rock, and who fed you in the wilderness with manna. They were hungry. What was God going to do? He provides manna. He did everything that they needed to protect his people, to love his people, to care for them. And that your fathers did not, so manna that your fathers did not know, that he might, 1, humble you, 2, test you. Why? To do you good in the end. So when we are facing troubles and fears and tests and we don't know what to do, there is purpose for everything that happens to us. It's to humble us and to test us so that God can bring us to a good end. God is in control. He has purpose for whatever is happening to us. And you know, and I know that we're going through some hard times. The three big things, our health, the economy, politics, justice. We're going through really hard times. And what do I see amongst Christians? Fear, anxiety, uh, yelling and carrying on instead of being loving and kind the way God wants us to be. So let's love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength so that we can trust Him through all these things. And then let us love one another as we love ourselves. Let's our tone of voice be that of kindness, loving kindness. And this is what God would want for us. And because God is allowing us to go through these things, in fact, He's kind of made it this way, hasn't He? So that, as He says here, as Moses says here, to humble us, to test us, to bring about good in the end. Well, he gives us that synopsis of the Exodus to Numbers situation. He covers it, all the territory, in just these few verses. And the one that I really want to zero in on is, remember it says up here in verse 15, and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock. Now, I've given you two columns here because this water situation that God brought water out of a rock for them happens 2 times during the wilderness years. It happens before they get to Sinai. And that's the first generation Jewish people. Before they even get to Sinai, they run out of, right after the Lord had taken them through the sea and delivered them from the Egyptians. They're crying out because they have no water. And then you would think that the second generation, 40 years later, would know better. But they do the same thing. They cry out against God and Moses because there's no water. They become fearful, anxiety-ridden, and not trusting Him, not believing Him. And so what happens is they're overwhelmed. And yet God is right there with them, and He takes care of them by bringing water to them. So I want to show you this because this inclusio around the wilderness years, the one at the beginning with the rock and the water, and the one at the end with the rock and the water, this forms an inclusio or bookends around all the wilderness years. And bookends tell us something. They tell us what is happening in between. And so in between, the murmuring, the unbelief is so dominant throughout. In fact, they don't even go into the land when God says to the first generation, come on, I'm ready to take you into the land that I have promised you. And what do? They get so fearful that they start to rebel. See, when we allow fear to control us, what happens? We're not trusting God. We're trusting ourselves and our own thoughts, and they're wishy-washy and a mess. And so we have to choose to trust God. And so what we're going to do is see what the author has done with this inclusio, because what's in the first column, which is in Exodus 17, the first generation in the wilderness, and Numbers 20, which is the second generation 40 years later, they have common words and phrases that we're going to look for. So I want you to circle them, okay? Draw lines. Do whatever you can in order to um, uh, keep it going. Okay, so Exodus 17, 1 to 7. The beginning of the wilderness trek, the first generation. So it says this: all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of Yahweh, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses. Lack of trust leads us to doing the wrong thing. They quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test Yahweh?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to Yahweh, which they should have done, cried to Yahweh in trust and faith. "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And Yahweh said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb," or that's the other name for Sinai, "and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah. Do you remember that in Hebrews, where we studied about Psalm 95, which talks about the unbelief at Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested Yahweh by saying, "Is Yahweh among us or not?" What was the sign that they didn't believe, trust in God? Well, they said, "Is Yahweh among us or not?" Of course he was among us. He was right there with them. Now watch this second column, because there are so many things that are the same. Numbers 20, second generation. Now there was no water. Where'd you hear that before? In verse 1 in the left column. And we now have it in verse 2 of the right-hand column. There was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses. Oh my goodness, same exact words as in verse 2 on the left column. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before Yahweh." They're talking about those who did not believe God at Kadesh Barnea, and they all died in the wilderness. They're saying, "Oh, why we should have died with them instead of going through this. Why have you brought the assembly of Yahweh into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt?" Ooh, did you see that in verse 3 in the left-hand column? They say the same words. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt? Their parents taught them well, didn't they? Yeah. To bring us to this evil place. It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and in it there is no water to drink. And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff." He said the same thing in verse 5 in the left-hand column, didn't he? "And take in your hand the staff, and assemble the congregation, and tell the rock." In the first story, he was to strike the rock. In the second story, he was to tell the rock. But the rock is there, isn't it? Before their eyes, to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before Yahweh, there's that staff again, as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. And Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe in me. So not only did the children of Israel not believe in him, but now we see Moses and Aaron not believe in God. To uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel. And we really don't know which part of this that showed that they didn't believe God, or even if it's told to us in what way they didn't believe God. Some people say, oh, it's because he hit the rock twice. Oh, it's because he was proud and said he was hitting the rock and bringing water out. There's a number of different excuses for Moses to show where he didn't believe God. But all we know really is that he didn't believe God. And belief, trusting God, is as important in the Old Testament as it is in the New Testament. Don't ever think that the children of Israel got to heaven because they obeyed the law. No, it's because they believed, as Abraham had. He believed God, and God counted it to him for righteousness. And so Moses and the people should have believed God. That's what we need to do. We need to trust him and know that he'll go through anything with us, and that we need nothing except God our Father. Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. So not only are the first generation Israelites not able to enter the land, but now Moses and Aaron aren't able to. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with Yahweh. Did you see those words, Meribah, quarrel, in the first column at the bottom? Now they're in the second column. Like father, like son, like mother, like daughter, people have a tendency, if they aren't strong in the Lord, to do what their parents did wrong. And that's what they're doing. They're doing it again. So what Moses is doing with this inclusio, or these bookends, is telling us really this is the way they were all through the wilderness. And yet that rock that was there in the beginning of the inclusio and there at the end, we're going to be told, was there throughout the whole thing. Now let's look at another portion in Deuteronomy on your second page. And because we are now being told who that rock is. Deuteronomy 32:15 says, but Jeshurun, that's a pet name for Israel. Yes, God had a pet name for his people, and it was Jeshurun. Grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook God, the God who made him, Israel, and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They scoffed at God, who is called the rock of their salvation. And when did they do that? Every time they did not believe and trust in him. It's a choice, isn't it? I remember our pastor saying years ago, and since then, the hardest thing for him to do every morning is to choose to trust God. It is a hard thing because we look at all the circumstances around us, but we need to choose to trust God. It's a choice. Deuteronomy 32:18 says this, you, Israel, were unmindful. So they scoffed the rock. Now they're unmindful of the rock. They paid him no attention. They turned away from him to their own misery, their own fears. The rock that bore you. Oh my goodness. Isn't that beautiful saying? The rock bore them. And you forgot the God who gave you birth. Now we know what it means that God bore them. He carried he was like a woman carrying a babe in the womb. That's God who bore them, the rock who bore them, who gave them birth. And then Deuteronomy 32:31. Notice they're all from Deuteronomy 32 because this is a poem about Yahweh written by the hand of Moses. And it says, for their rock, and he's talking about the pagan nations, for their rock is not as our rock. Our enemies are by themselves. They don't have a rock like we have. So the world is topsy-turvy right now. The economy, politics, COVID, the health. We're in a turmoil. Let not that be so concerning us. We have a rock who sticks with us, goes through everything with us. Then we have 1 Corinthians. So we saw this inclusio around, which tells us that rock was there. And also their murmuring and complaining and quarreling was there all the way through. Yet the rock was going to stick with them. And Paul tells us this in 1 Corinthians 10. He also, because he knows Deuteronomy, is going to give a synopsis, a very short synopsis. I think it's 4 verses long, of the wilderness years. Now listen to his, because it's the same thing that happened on the other side of the page. For I do not want you to be unaware, Paul says to his brothers, the people he's writing to, that our fathers were all under the cloud. Remember, God guided them, cloud by day, fire by night, and all passed through the sea that opened up to let them go through on dry land. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate from the same spiritual food. Remember the manna in Deuteronomy 8? That's it, the spiritual food. And all drank the same spiritual drink. That's the water that came from the rock. Okay, so all ate the same spiritual food, the same spiritual drink for 40 years. For they drank from the spiritual, what? Rock. So he's calling it a rock too, isn't he? A rock that was there for them, that followed them. The rock followed them? Yeah, remember what I told you. The rock was right there all the way through. And the rock was, wait a second. The rock is Yahweh, concerning in Deuteronomy. But here we're told the rock is Christ. Why? Because Christ is Yahweh. So the rock wasn't merely there at the beginning and at the end, but all the way through it says that followed them. But all the way through, It's wonderful to know that the tests and the things that we go through are purposeful. And Moses tells us, and the people, to do you good in the end. To do you good. Can you believe that? Can you believe that COVID, the economy, the politics, all that's going on today in society is for our good. But it's for our good because it teaches us to trust Him. I know how hard it is. Believe me, one of my Achilles heel is anxiety. So I know, and I'm just at 73. I still have to go to the Lord and place it in His hands and say, "It's not my hands anymore, Lord. I choose to trust you because I know that this test keeps me humble, keeps me trusting you, and it'll all be for my good." Okay, guys, I love you all and I miss you so much. We're going to have to talk about fall one of these weeks. And goodbye.